Hello and welcome to Explorations in Economic History and Thought, Socialism. And in this first section, we'll talk about Marx and why we should be studying Marx in the first place, and the Soviet Union, the Soviet experiment with socialism, and how it relates to Marx, and also I'll give a brief overview about the course and my way of thinking about it. And we should keep in mind, of course, that when studying another culture from the outside, for those of us who weren't raised in Russia, we should keep in mind that we are always going to miss things. As historians and as economists, we're going to simplify things. But I think it's important to study as economists, as economic historians, the experiment in any country. With any type of system, and to do our best to take lessons from even a simplified model of what that system was and how it differs from our own system. So we'll talk about why we should study Marx, why we should study the Soviet Union, and some of the pitfalls and things to be aware of as we do study it over the course of this course. So when we ask why we should study Marx, one question that comes up is whether the Soviet Union was actually based on Marxist thought, and whether, for example, if the same Marxist theories and foundation were to form the basis of the political system in, say, America, that the same outcome would occur. You know, was the Soviet Union actually so based on Marxist theory and based on the framework of Marx, not just his analysis of capitalism, but his actual plan for a new society, that if the same theories were used, say, in America, that it would come out also as the socialist and communist system that it was. And we'll talk about the difference between socialism and communism, and what occurred in the Soviet Union, and whether it could be classified as socialist under a Marxist definition, and what communism was, and whether it ever occurred in the Soviet Union over the course of this semester. So we're going to argue that the Soviet Union was an experiment testing the theories of Marx and his followers, other Marxists, such as Lenin. And before we go on to look at some arguments for the fact that the Soviet Union was based on Marxist thought, we can have a quick appeal to authority. This is a quote from János Kornai, who was a state economist in Hungary and wrote several books about the socialist system, or the political economy of communism, as he called one of his books. And in this quote, he simply says that he believes that everything that happened in the Soviet Union and the communist regions was fundamentally a realization of what Marx saw as the socialist system that would replace capitalism. So, what did Marx intend? Did he intend to that his followers, that people who put into practice his ideas, would create something like the Soviet Union? Is that what he intended? Well, for one thing, some people argue that a truly Marxist system would have been much more decentralized and democratic. Perhaps it would be a democratic socialism. Perhaps it wouldn't be all power to the state. It would be power to decentralized councils and so on. Well, one place to start is to realize that in the Communist Manifesto, he did argue for the centralization of all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, the workers' state, at least for the first stage, the lower stage of communism, or socialism, which was Lenin's term for Marx's lower stage of communism. Now, this could still be somewhat decentralized states, you know, different councils across the whole of the Soviet Union. However, it was the centralization of the means of production in the hands of the workers' state. The workers' state. Until the state dissolved away, it would be in the hands of the state. So even if it was decentralized, it was still the means of production in the hands of the state. So when we ask why study Marx, keeping in mind that Marx argued for the means of production to be centralized in the hands of the workers' state, we can see that it's important for economics to look at the outcome of Marxist states so that we can better understand what it's like to have complete public ownership across all of society. Because this is what it means for the means of production to be in the hands of the state. It means that public ownership, not private ownership, governs all economic production and distribution and accounting. So it does lead to planning, and we'll talk more about that. And it does offer us an opportunity to learn about what they learned, what the state, what the planners and the leaders in the Soviet Union discovered about public ownership when they had a society that was entirely governed by public ownership. And this understanding of public ownership versus private ownership offers a lot of possibilities for economists to learn about the meaning of these institutions, and this can be relevant to us when we're considering whether to nationalize or privatize in various industries. Of course, there is a limitation to it because a mixed economy will have different results from public ownership, given that it will also have private ownership. However, there are some lessons I think that we can learn, and we can distinguish whether they're important in a mixed economy in addition to in an economy entirely governed by public ownership. So I do believe there are lessons relevant to us, but we have to be careful as we go about learning them from the Soviet experiment. There have been economists in the past who have looked at the lessons from the Soviet experience, especially the 1965 reforms. So here are a couple of them. Michael Ellman and Vladimir Kontorovich have offered quite a few studies of the lessons of the Soviet Union, of their experience with reforms and with different stages of their economy. And so, as you can see here, right around the 1965 reforms, Michael Ellman wrote about it, and he recently wrote a summary of some of the lessons that he believes economics, mainstream economics, should take from the long history of Sovietology and studying of the Soviet economy. And Kontorovich also wrote about the 1965 economic reforms and some broader studies, again, more recently as well. So some of the studies have been very close up case studies of, like, for example, the reforms, and looked a lot at what the planners were actually doing, not always looking at all of the lessons and then applying them back to economics, but that is what Michael Ellman's recent paper was attempting to do. So there's a history of looking at the lessons for economists, for economics. However, I think a lot more should be done looking at the experience, and in the further reading at the end, you'll see that I wrote a book about it as well that you can. So how does one go about learning from the Soviet experiment with socialism? And what are some of the caveats? And how should we learn from specific policies, such as the 1965 reforms, and how should we go about learning from planning overall? So from one of the papers I just showed you, the recent paper by Kontorovich of 2001, he speaks about some of the caveats and some of the issues and lessons that can be learned. And he wrote, quote, "Accounts of the Soviet economic mechanism," written back in 1965, around the time of the reforms, quote, "eschewed the important role of arbitrary decisions. The focus was on the systematic, rule-guided behavior, planning procedures, price formulae, bonus schemes, and economic agents' self-seeking behavior around these rules. But if the ruler was unlimited, then he could do whatever he wanted. The history of Soviet-type economies is full of examples of arbitrary, ruinous schemes." So he's pointing out that although it's very good and important for economists to learn about what happens when self-seeking individuals have to work around the rules put out, such as pricing formulae, that the planners set up, although that's very important, it's also important to realize that the ruler had sometimes unlimited powers and could put arbitrary schemes together, and that this has to be taken into account as well as simply the response to the kinds of things that we are aware of in market economies, such as price setting. One of the examples that he gives is that one of the first decisions made by the Politburo after Stalin's death was the cancellation of a whole, quote, a whole set of construction projects undertaken with forced labor. So, in other words, Stalin was the only one who really fancied doing these projects, and as soon as he died, the Politburo rolled them back. So that was an arbitrary choice made by Stalin, the personality, and this has to be taken into account when looking at the results in planned economies. So the choice of planners is important, as well as the response of the self-interested individuals to the things set up by the planners, such as prices and output and so forth. So both are important to look at when considering the results in planned economies. So this brings up another important point. Some will argue that the Soviet Union maybe was originally a Marxist, based on Marxist ideas and a Marxist workers' state, but the system degenerated. So by the time Stalin came to power, or once Stalin was in power, it was no longer based on Marxist ideas, which were democratic, but was based on the arbitrary rule or the arbitrary plans of a single ruler, of a single personality. So, but then other people will argue that the progression towards that result was inevitable, that once you put the entire means of production in the hands of the state, that your inevitable personality. So, but then other people will argue that the progression towards that result was inevitable, that once you put the entire means of production in the hands of the state, that you're inevitable, as people say, then that would mean necessarily that all these different stages that occurred in the Soviet Union that were very different from each other would all have to be Marxist, and that this doesn't make sense. So, in other words, was war communism Marxist, and NEP was Marxist, and Stalin's rise to power, and the classical socialist period, the reform periods, and perestroika, all of these are Marxist? And if they are all Marxist, then what does that actually say about Marxism? And wouldn't it mean that, some other outcome might have been possible? I mean, for example, weren't there periods when it looked like there might have been a more democratic outcome? And if all of those different stages, all of those very different periods were all based on Marx, then there could have been something entirely different, something much more democratic that could also be based on Marx. And what about in a different country, in a more developed economy? What about, how would it look if you implemented Marx today in the United States or Europe? Would it necessarily be Stalinist if, in fact, all those different stages in the Soviet Union were all Marxist? Couldn't there have been a much more democratic, different outcome if it was put into practice today in a more developed country? So I think being able to answer that is a very important reason for studying the Soviet Union. And we can ask, if it did degenerate, as some proponents of socialist and Marxist ideas will say, into state capitalism, totalitarianism, bureaucratic waste, and so on under Stalin, was this inevitable? And why? Why did it degenerate? If it wasn't inevitable, what happened? What went wrong? Why did it degenerate? And so one of the arguments is Hayek's argument about the worst getting on top in a power struggle. So perhaps it was inevitable when Lenin died, if one could argue that Lenin wasn't as bad as Stalin, that when Lenin died, there would be a power struggle and the most vicious person would win, which was Stalin, of course. And there are other arguments, though, such as priorities. Not only the priorities in production, such as whether to prioritize military production over consumer production, but also whether and which rights are paramount, and how those are balanced against economic rights and against other questions. So, for example, if the media is all in the hands of the state, does that mean that it will necessarily become just a voice box for the state? Or if the rights of free speech are made paramount, is it possible with some form of planning, some form of democratic or non-democratic ownership, is it possible if you put free speech rights at the forefront, that even if the media is completely owned by the worker state, that some form of worker state and some form of democracy would allow free speech to be kept. So we have to ask whether, if those rights are put paramount, the same thing will happen, inevitably. So then we can ask other questions about the possibilities of cooperation, of a market socialism that is still Marxist, about the importance of learning and culture and human nature. Still, many people will argue that it doesn't make any sense to look at a fully centrally planned economy like the Soviet Union, since nobody's really advocating that anymore. Why not look at a mixed economy, democratic countries, rather than look at the pure case of, a fully centrally planned, a fully public ownership economy? And of course, even if very few people are arguing for a fully centrally planned economy, some people do still think that Marx made a lot of good points and that perhaps Marx was right. And there are people advocating for various kinds of economic systems, such as anarchy, market socialism, and social democratic systems of various sorts. So aren't there still some lessons that can be learned from looking at a full public ownership economy in order to better understand public versus private ownership? That's what I'll be arguing. And so why not look at mixed economies in order to get these answers? Well, in short, the rationale for it is in fact that it is such an extreme system because, in Elinor Ostrom's words, it is the simplest possible organism in which the process under investigation occurs. So Elinor Ostrom, recent Nobel laureate in economics, argued that for economists as well as biologists, the simplest possible organism in which a process under investigation occurs in a clarified or even exaggerated form. That is the best way to look at a process. It provides clear information about the processes involved. So if we're going to do this, how do we proceed? Well, first we'll study Marx. We'll ask whether he only criticized capitalism, how did he envision socialism, and so forth. And some say that he advocated a democratic socialism. We'll look at that question and try to understand what Marx did envision. And then once we have an understanding of what Marx favored, we'll study Lenin. And of course, Lenin was a revolutionary political leader, but he was also a theorist. And Marx also was a bit of a revolutionary leader himself. He did urge workers to throw off their chains and to bring about socialism, right away. He wasn't just theorizing about a slow evolutionary process that would happen, over many generations. So if he was arguing for revolution and for bringing about socialism in the short term, then Lenin might be seen as a fairly good example of how that might turn out, since he actually was a Marxist and he did attempt to implement what he saw as Marx's theories. At least that is what he said, and taking him at his word, we can see how closely he kept to Marx's ideas and what the outcome of that was. So we'll look at Marx's theories, see if they actually made any sense based on his labor theory of value. That will be our first stop. And labor theory of value is what underlies Marx's exploitation theory. And we'll look at what it means to have democratic use of commonly owned resources and consider that in theory and in practice. And we'll compare it to compare Marx's model of the capitalist economy and his labor theory of value and his ideas about the socialist economy we'll compare that to classical and neoclassical, including Austrian models, and try to understand both theory and practice of the Marxist way of thinking and how we can understand it from other alternative perspectives.